Hello and welcome everyone. Welcome to Development Economics 2. And as you know, we have been discussing this topic of trade production pattern and world inequality. Today's presentation is structured in this following manner. We'll have a brief recap of what we have done so far, and then we shall introduce the learning objectives of today's class. And then we have broadly two topics to cover today. One, we're going to focus on the convergence-divergence debate. And two, we will look at the official version of UNCTAD with regard to this relationship between trade, production pattern, and world inequality. And then we shall conclude. Let's recap. So far what we have done. We have discussed in the previous classes the importance of international trade, and we have also presented the inequality pattern over time and across different countries. We have also discussed the patterns of trade and patterns of inequality, how we can measure inequality along various axes and so on. Then we have provided a broad understanding of the linkage between the trade production pattern and inequality. We have then moved on to the discussion of why we need to understand the period of colonization and how colonialism played a key role in the divergence between countries. And in that regard, trade actually played a very important role. And we have introduced the concepts of terms of trade, core versus periphery. And it is in that regard we have discussed the idea of secular decline in terms of trade between the developing country versus the developed countries. And this idea came from this hypothesis known as Previs-Singer hypothesis. Now, Previs-Singer hypothesis argued that the core country benefits more from the trade because they are focusing on production and export of final goods as compared to the developing countries who are primarily producing the primary goods. Now, what happens as they get into trade? Over the long run, the terms of trade goes against the developing countries, the periphery countries, and more in favor of the core countries. Okay, now we move on to today's learning objectives. First, we shall have a discussion on inter-country inequality, where we are going to discuss about the convergence-divergence debate. And then we shall understand or take a look at the UNCTAD's official version about this relationship between trade and inequality and what are the policy recommendations they make. Okay, let's move on to convergence or divergence. What's happening over the years in the recent past? Remember, we ended our previous discussion with the hypothesis of divergence between the developed and developing countries. One of the theoretical background came from the Previs-Singer hypothesis. Let's look at what's happening in the last few decades and so on. Now, if you look at the inequality can be understood from two ways, as we have argued before as well. You can think of it as within country inequality or between countries inequality. It has become a major issue across countries and for citizens as well as for government policymakers. Now, the recent literature on inequality, highlight the fact that there's a clear trend in rising within country inequality. But in contrast to that, the trend with regard to the between country inequality or the inter-countries inequality is a bit different. So this is something we're going to look at today. Okay, now we shall quickly present a graph also in a minute so that you understand what we are talking about. What we are going to look at is we are taking the average income of the developing countries and we're kind of comparing it with the average income of the developed countries. Now it is adjusted by purchasing power parity. The definition of the same is provided in the slide. Now if we look at that particular ratio of average income in developing countries vis-a-vis the average income in developed countries, if that ratio rises over time, it implies the numerator, remember the GDP per capita of the developing countries is growing at a comparatively faster rate than the denominator, which is GDP per capita of the developed nations. Now that's a good thing. If that ratio is rising, that means the income gap between these two set of countries is kind of narrowing down. On the other hand, if that is kind of declining, it's not a good sign because that would imply a divergence between these two set of countries. If that doesn't change over time, you understand the gap remains. It doesn't change too much. Okay, so let's look at what's happening. We are arguing that this gap has been closing down over the last couple of decades, especially since the decade of 2000s. So we are continuing with the idea of convergence or divergence. Now this whole idea of catch-up is very much related to countries like India and China. Now, what they have done is their growth has played a key role in the narrowing down of this gap between developed and developing countries. There is a rapid growth in per capita income, especially with respect to Asian countries. And that has been the major source of this global convergence. We shall present it in a minute. Now, the gap between the Asian region and the developed region has changed in the following manner. Imagine in 1990, it was about 14% of the average income of the developed nations. What do we mean by that? Think of the Asia's average income in 1990 or 1991, around that time. It was 14% of what it was of the developed nations. Now that has changed to 25%. So you can clearly see that has actually increased. Now you will see on the slide that we are talking about a declining gap. Now if this is increasing, the gap is actually declining. Now this is a remarkable achievement. But nevertheless, let's not forget that still it's just 1/4 of the average income of the developed nations. So there's a miles to go. Now let's focus on this graph that is on your screen. Let's look at the black line, as you can see here. This line is going up over the years. Now that is the average income ratio for developing countries. Oh, just to remind you, what are we measuring on the y-axis? We are taking the ratio of GDP per capita of a particular region. In this case, it is all the developing countries put together, 116 developing countries, divided by the GDP per capita of the developed nations. Now, that ratio is rising. The black line shows that is rising. Now, where is the line for Asian countries? That's the sky color line that you are seeing. It's almost coinciding. Now, if you look at the other lines, they are not really rising as much. Now, clearly, this pattern is kind of dominated by Asia. It's much clearer here if you see on this graph on the screen that if you take all the developing countries put together, which is the orange line, or this is going up. But then if you take developing countries excluding Asia, then this is not changing much. So what are we saying here? You are saying that the trend towards convergence begins with China, India since 1980s and 90s, and slowly the other Asian countries also joined the club. Nonetheless, the global income convergence has been largely concentrated in and around the Asian countries. Now that's not a broad-based story, right? So there is a convergence, but the convergence is not broad-based. And even though there is a decreasing gap between these two set of countries, the gap still remains considerably high as yet. Now, if we exclude Asia, the whole story of divergence and convergence changes considerably, as you can once again see on the graph on your screen. Okay, now it's your turn. Can you think of the question, right? Do you think that the diminishing inter-country income gap, or what we are calling as the convergence, is broad-based, or is it led by a specific set of countries? We asked you a question. Do you think the diminishing inter-country income gap, which we are calling as the convergence, is broad-based, or is it led by a specific set of countries? Now, this is very clear from the discussion we just had. This is not exactly broad-based. It's very Asia-centric. Okay, now we shall move on to the official version of UNCTAD. What is UNCTAD? It is the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. And why are we even considering it? Now, if you just Google it and just go to the website of UNCTAD, this is exactly what they say about themselves. Let's take a look at it very carefully. They say, and I read, globalization, including a phenomenal expansion of trade, has helped lift millions out of poverty, but not nearly enough people have benefited, and tremendous challenges remain. They go on saying, we support developing countries to access the benefits of a globalized economy more fairly and effectively. Mind these words. And we help equip them to deal with the potential drawbacks of greater economic integration. To do this, we provide analysis, facilitate consensus building, and offer technical assistance. This helps them to use trade, investment, finance, and technology as vehicles for inclusive and sustainable development. Now, if you look at their role, you understand the role from this particular paragraph. But what we really want to highlight from what they're starting with, they're saying, of course, trade has developed a lot of people. It has increased income, lift up a lot of people out of poverty. But then they're also highlighting the fact that there's a lot to do. It has not benefited as much as it could have. And time and again, they're saying their role comes in so that it becomes inclusive, it can benefit a lot more people. So what we understand here, that there is already a tension that they are highlighting with regard to trade liberalization and inequality. With global trade, what's happening with inequality? Let's move on and look at their official version. What they're saying, that of course international trade has been an instrumental thing in terms of development process, especially with respect to developing countries in the last few decades and so on. We have seen that many developing countries have taken trade reforms, which has, after that they have also seen higher economic growth. So higher economic growth kind of followed trade reforms in many countries in the world, as they are arguing. Now, the growth acceleration in these developing countries are also kind of led by, as we just mentioned, India and China, and also compared to other developed countries, this has been like phenomenal. What has happened with this process of integration, in process of global integration? There's also been some sort of polarization, especially in income distribution within a particular country, not like between countries. Now, just take a look at the growth performance of India, China, compare it with the growth performance of world economy and OECD members, the developed countries in particular. Now, what we are showing here is the average annual growth for the period of 1990 to 2019. You can clearly see on your screen that China had a fantastic growth, and so did India, although it is a little lesser than China, but both these countries had phenomenally high growth. Now compare it with the global growth. You can clearly see how these two countries have outperformed the average global performance. Now also, just keep it in mind that when you compare developing and developed countries and look at their growth rate, there's always something called a base effect. If you start from a low base, there's a possibility of higher growth. But one thing is very clear, that these countries, especially countries like India and China, some other Asian countries as well, they had exceptionally high growth, and that has helped reduce the gap, which is something we just discussed before. So this is also something UNCTAD is actually agreeing with. What they are now saying, that if you look at on your screen, what we are showing is the Thiel index of economic inequality. The total inequality seems to be declining since the early 2000s, but that decline is clearly led by decrease in inter-country inequality. That's the dotted line, the inter-country inequality, that is between countries. Now, if you look at within countries inequality, that is showing a sluggish rise, especially after 2000, 2005, 4, 5, around that time. So, what are they saying? They're saying there's a phenomenal growth, there's a narrowing down of the income gap, as we just discussed, but the within countries inequality is somewhat on the rise. Now, question for you. Think of a country which grew at a much faster rate than the world economy during the period of globalization. On the question of the name of a country, can you think of a name of a country which grew faster rate than the world economy over the period of globalization? Of course, if you just go back and see the growth curves on your growth figures on your screen, it's clearly China is definitely one of them. Of course, also India. Now, we have shown that there's a declining between countries inequality and there's a sluggish rise. Now remember, China is a country that has had exceptionally good export growth and economic growth. Just before we move on to the discussion of within country inequality, let's just look at what happened to China's inequality. Now, we have discussed it earlier as well. China is one of the most unequal countries in the world. While they have had very good growth, inequality also rose over this period. Barring the last few years where there's a little decline in the inequality, be it in terms of Gini, be it in terms of the income share of the richest class versus the poorest class and so on. Not only in terms of the level of inequality, also over this whole period of, let's say, 1990 to 2014-15, over this entire period, the change in inequalities also seem to be highest for China. These are shown on the graph on the right side of your screen. The level in 2015 and is the top right corner you see it's regional comparison of inequality levels. If you compare the regional inequality trends, there is also China tops the table. Okay, so what could be the factors that kind of link international trade to income inequality? We are still looking at the UNCTAD's official version. Now, what they're saying that this effect is mostly context specific, but then they highlight a couple of factors which could be important to understand this link. One of the factors they're saying there's something called the offshoring model. Offshoring is, as we know, some sort of outsourcing. Some of the works can be shifted from the developed to developing nation, and that has its own consequences. It can create inequality because some of these works that have been shifted are considered high skilled in developing countries, leads to increasing demand for skilled workers, and therefore, as a result, there is a increasing wage gap within the working class itself. There's an increasing wage inequality within the working class between high-skilled and low-skilled workers. We'll come back to this in our further sessions. Okay, the other factor can be what they're arguing is that there is the impact of trade is diverse in terms of different local communities. So let's think of urban area versus rural area. It could be the case in urban areas benefit comparatively more compared to the rural areas. By the way, it can also be geographical or regional in that sense, that some of the coastal area benefits comparatively more than the hinterland, which is something true for China, for example. They have a lot of regional inequality in that sense. So the impact of trade can be very diverse in terms of who benefits, in terms of which of the local communities benefit in which way. It could be rural compared to urban, some of these things. Now, third thing, now this is a very important thing. One of the key arguments of trade liberalization was it leads to higher efficiency because it kind of promotes competition. But if you look at the reality, in reality, the global markets many a time are dominated by some of the big firms. You can think of many just now. If you just Google it or think about it, there are big players in the market who dominate the global economy. Now, if international trade is dominated by a specific set of big players, that creates a lot of problems. That, of course, creates an issue of inequality apart from other problems. Now, as a result, the small enterprises, the marginalized sections in the society, for example, women-led enterprises and youth, they're looking for employment opportunities or they're thinking of starting some sort of startup. Some of these kinds of enterprises, they face a trouble the moment there's a dominance of large firms in global market, right? Now, they also identify trade policies. Trade policies themselves could be something that can lead or that can kind of promote inequality. It could be, for example, there can be measures such as product quality control or standards which like you can't export unless you meet certain standards. Now, this could be problematic for countries which may not have that much control, quality control infrastructure or productive capacity. Then, international trade also leads to structural transformation in various countries, especially with respect to developing countries. Now, in many developing countries, what has happened is that international trade has taken place in conjunction with increased specialization in production of commodities and low value-added goods, which had little benefit for a positive effect on wages of unskilled workers. So, what it implies is if through international trade, the product composition changes towards more in favor of primary goods, intermediate goods, or low value-added commodities, it may not benefit much, and it will not benefit much, most of the unskilled workforce. And in many developing countries, they are the largest in numbers. So that can create some sort of distributional issues. Now, finally, they again reiterate the fact that while we identify some of these factors as important factors for understanding the relationship between international trade and inequality, but it also depends on social, political, geographical context. The context factor does not go away. Nevertheless, there are certain factors as we have discussed. For example, just quickly to summarize, the impact of offshoring model, the diverse impact on local communities, the dominance of large firms in the global market, the trade policies, and also the structural transformation that follow. Some of these things are some of the factors that they identify apart from the context-specific issues. Okay, now, before we move on, one more question for you. How do you think the dominance of large firms can affect domestic inequality in case of in this particular regard, international trade and income inequality? How the dominance of large firms in the global market can affect domestic inequality? So we have asked a question. How do you think dominance of large firms can affect domestic inequality? Now, this is not a straightforward question, but one thing is very clear. some of the factors that UNCTAD has identified, the dominance of large firms is one of them. Of course, it depends on how the domestic policies are structured, which country we are talking about, what are the relationship between different countries, whether this particular big firm belongs to a certain country or the other country. There are a lot of complex issues, but some of the things are very clear, which we can discuss now. Think of a big firm playing in an international trade era. Now, what is happening there is, if it's a very big firm, it can play around, tweak some of the trading conditions. It has a huge market power. Now, which will benefit itself, but it may not benefit a lot of people who are, let's say, trading with such big corporations. Now, this is just one of the sources how the big firm can, through the unfair kind of exchange rate or trading rate or transaction rate of exchange or transactions, not the dollar-rupee exchange kind of exchange, the rate of transactions, the price ratios. Some of these things will be influenced the moment this monopoly power of a particular corporation rises. Okay. But this question was not meant to give a very specific answer. It is also to make you think about this particular question. Okay, these are some of the pointers that we are providing here, but think about this particular question a little more. Okay, so what have we done so far? We have engaged with the convergence divergence debate, and we have also looked at how UNCTAD is identifying various factors which could be linking international trade with inequality, especially within countries inequality. Okay. Now that they have identified some of the factors which could lead to increasing inequality, they're also talking about various policy recommendations. Now, one of the policy recommendations is, as you know, their role is to give some policy suggestion. One of the things that they're highlighting is trade policy. Now, they're saying that there's of course a possibility of efficiency gain through international trade, but that need not be the only goal of a trade. They're suggesting that the trade policies should be such that help the poorer countries and small firms and other marginalized sections of population. Remember, this was actually one of the points that some of the marginalized sections may not benefit the moment there's a dominant firm in the global market. So the trade policies actually have to think about poorer countries as well as poorer sections of a society. Now, if trade leads to increasing inequality, there's always a tension. Should we curtail trade, kind of reduce trade? They're saying, of course not. We should not get into lesser trade. Actually, we should have more trade, but more inclusive trade. The trade policy should be such that the trade is inclusive. So instead of getting rid of trade itself or reducing trade, we should think of more inclusive trade. One of the things that can actually make trade a little more inclusive, for example, the government can make certain up-to-date information available for smaller enterprises. For example, information regarding market access conditions, on the complex processes linked to regulatory compliances. Now, why is this so important? As a student of economics, you already know information is very, very important, right? Especially in case of market transactions. Now, think of an example. Suppose you live in a very rural area where you don't have much infrastructure. Let's say the government of India has a particular fellowship program for the poorer sections of our society. But if that information does not percolate to actually those people who need such fellowship, it will not benefit them. So similarly, the governments can actually play a role where they can make certain information, up-to-date information available for the smaller enterprises who may not have otherwise access to some of these things. Okay. Now, there has to be proper export promotion programs, and they should be designed in such a way that they encourage and ensures that the smaller firms tend to participate. Remember, apart from this whole idea of reducing inequality and so on, the participation of larger and smaller firms also helps with the efficiency argument itself, because there's a monopolization otherwise that happens through the process if the smaller firms do not join. Not only they do not get the benefit out of it, there's a problem of efficiency that arises out of the increasing monopoly in the market. Now, this is exactly the same point. We should actually enhance more competition. Both nationally and internationally. Therefore, we need to help the small firms benefit from international trade so that there is an increasing competitive environment. This is a very, very, very important point. we need to promote labor provisions in trade agreements. Because, often what happens in workers in both developed and developing countries, they may not receive their fair share of benefits from participation in global trade. Bangladesh, for example, is one of the fastest growing countries, among the small countries. Now, they have a huge export growth. One of the important items that they export is garments. Now, garments is one of the major source of Bangladesh's export. Now, if you look at the working condition in some of the factories, that may not be very good. So, within the very trade policy, trade agreements itself, there has to be provision for, the working class here. They may not benefit otherwise from the very trade process. Okay, now multilateral cooperation also is required to reduce inequality among countries. There has to be provision of equal opportunities in global trade, in particular for developing countries. Now, development assistance to reduce inequality between countries. For example, you can think of agreement on trade facilitation of the World Trade Organization. Now, such development assistance should be to promote increased productive capacity, in particular for developing countries. Okay, now we come to conclusion of our presentation today. We have discussed that the whole idea of trade production pattern and inequality is a very complex and multidimensional matter. And we have identified that the whole idea of inequality needs to be seen through the lens of between countries and within countries inequality. And we have engaged today with the whole debate of convergence versus divergence. We have identified the fact that yes, there are indications of increasing convergence, but that is not very broad-based. It's more Asia-centric. And also, even in case of Asia, if you compare the developed countries and Asia, the gap is still very high. And finally, we have looked at the official version of UNCTAD with regard to the relationship between trade and inequality, and what are the things that the governments of different countries and different trade organizations can actually do so that the small players and the poorer countries, they can also benefit from the international trade, and as a result, the trade becomes more inclusive in nature. Thank you.